It was just another day on the job for Officer Ryan, a white police officer patrolling a quiet suburban neighborhood. His partner, a K-9 named Max, was always by his side. Max had been trained to help him with various tasks during their patrols, from tracking suspects to locating objects. Ryan trusted Max with his life, and Max had never let him down. The neighborhood they patrolled was peaceful, and there were rarely any serious issues. But today, things were about to take a sharp turn. It started with a call coming in over the radio, a report of a disturbance at a nearby house. The dispatcher didn't have all the details, but it sounded like someone was causing a scene, and the situation might be getting out of hand. Officer Ryan was used to handling situations like this, so he quickly made his way to the location, Max following closely behind. As they arrived, Ryan noticed a man standing in front of the house. He appeared to be pacing back and forth, looking agitated. Ryan couldn't tell exactly what was going on, but he immediately got the feeling that something wasn't right. The man's body language was tense, and Ryan instinctively signaled Max to stay close. "Sir," Ryan called out, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. "Are you all right? What's going on here?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a few more steps forward, looking directly at Ryan, his eyes filled with anger or frustration. Before Ryan could react further, the man suddenly moved in a way that seemed threatening, as though he might charge at him. Ryan's instincts kicked in. He shouted for Max to take action. Max, trained for situations like this, immediately lunged toward the man. The officer had no idea who the man was, but he could see the struggle that followed. The situation escalated quickly. Max, as trained, began to control the man, but in the heat of the moment, things spiraled out of control. It was over before Ryan could comprehend what had happened. Max had subdued the man, but the struggle left him injured. Ryan rushed to check the man, but it was clear that the situation was much worse than he expected. His heart raced as he called for medical backup, but it was too late. The man, who had been caught in a moment of confusion or distress, was lifeless. As the officers at the scene took in the situation, Ryan was horrified to learn that the man he had just encountered was no ordinary citizen. The man was General Marcus Williams, a black U.S. Army general, known for his leadership and dedication to his country. Ryan's hands shook as he tried to piece together the shocking reality of what had just happened. The officer couldn't believe what he had just done, and he felt his stomach drop as the full weight of the situation began to sink in. The realization hit Ryan like a wave. This wasn't just another arrest. This was a tragedy, a life lost. The man he had just killed was not just any civilian. He was a highly respected figure in the military, someone who had served his country with honor. As the news began to spread, the confusion and shock would soon set in, and the entire community would be left to grapple with the aftermath of the devastating incident. The news of the tragic incident spread quickly. Officer Ryan couldn't shake the image of General Marcus Williams lying lifeless on the ground, the weight of the situation settling on him like a heavy blanket. He had never intended for this to happen. As the initial shock of what he had done wore off, he was left with a deep sense of confusion and regret. The more he thought about it, the harder it became to understand how it had all gone so wrong. At first, Ryan hadn't known who the man was. He had only seen a person in distress, acting erratically, and possibly becoming a threat. But now he learned that the man he had just encountered was a hero in his community, a man who had served his country with distinction for years. General Williams wasn't just any soldier. He was a decorated officer with a reputation for bravery and leadership. Ryan's heart sank as he thought about the family he had just shattered, the legacy he had taken away. The situation became even more complicated when Ryan learned something that made his stomach twist. General Williams had a daughter. The officer's mind raced as he tried to piece together the connection. He had no idea that the man he had just killed had family members who were high-ranking officials in law enforcement. It wasn't until the news broke that he learned the unimaginable. The general's daughter was an FBI agent, someone who served with integrity and honor, just like her father. Ryan could hardly believe it. How could it be possible? The realization that the general's daughter was not only a law enforcement officer, but also an FBI agent made everything feel even heavier. He could only imagine the pain and disbelief she must be experiencing. She was going to find out about her father's death, and the officer who had killed him was a fellow member of the law enforcement community. How could he ever face her? As the days passed, Ryan found himself constantly replaying the incident in his mind. He thought about what had gone wrong. Had he misread the situation? Was there something he could have done differently to de-escalate it before it became so violent? But there was no easy answer. It seemed as though everything happened in a blur, a series of events that spiraled too quickly for him to stop. He knew that he would have to answer for what had happened, but nothing could undo the damage that had been done. At the same time, news outlets picked up on the story, reporting the shocking incident. The general's name was soon plastered across newspapers and TV screens, and people were talking about it everywhere. The public's reaction was swift. Many were stunned, but others were angry. They demanded answers. Officer Ryan became the focus of a storm of public scrutiny, and the guilt he felt only deepened as he thought about the family and community who were mourning the loss of someone they had respected so deeply. All Ryan could do was wait. The investigation would soon begin, and he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But what hurt him the most was knowing that he had taken the life of a man who had done so much for his country, a man with a family who would now be left to deal with the fallout. He wondered how he would be able to explain it when the general's daughter, an FBI agent, came face to face with him. The weight of it all was nearly unbearable. The day that Officer Ryan received the news that General Marcus Williams had passed away, it was like everything in his world stopped. He had already been battling his emotions after the incident, but hearing that the general's daughter, a respected FBI agent, would be involved in the investigation was the last thing he expected. It felt like a punch to the gut. Her name was Agent Naomi Williams, and she had quickly made a name for herself within the FBI. She was known for her dedication, her unshakable commitment to justice, and her calm professionalism in even the most difficult cases. Ryan couldn't imagine what she must be feeling after the loss of her father, especially knowing that it was one of her own, a fellow law enforcement officer, who was responsible. His guilt seemed to multiply as he thought about Naomi. Naomi had received the news of her father's death late that night. At first, she had trouble believing it. She was used to hearing about dangerous missions and far-off places, but her father had always seemed invincible, a person who could never be hurt. The call from her superior at the FBI was the last thing she had ever expected. She was told that her father had been involved in an incident with a police officer, and it had ended tragically with his death. She couldn't process it immediately. Her mind was in shock. She had always admired her father's strength and leadership. Growing up, she had watched him lead with honor and integrity, never wavering in the face of difficulty. Naomi had always known that her father was a warrior in his own right, but now she had to face the heartbreaking reality that he was gone, and it was a police officer who had taken him from her. Naomi's emotions were a whirlwind of grief, anger, and confusion. But beyond that, there was a sense of responsibility weighing on her shoulders. As an FBI agent, she had to remain calm, keep her emotions in check, and investigate what had happened. The professional in her understood the need for justice, but the daughter inside her was screaming for answers. How could this have happened? Why had the officer acted so quickly, without fully understanding the situation? She had questions, and she needed answers, not just for her father, but for herself as well. As the days went by, Naomi found herself having to juggle her personal grief with her professional duties. It was incredibly difficult. She knew she had to be thorough in her investigation, but it was hard to remain objective when the person responsible was part of the very community she was devoted to protecting. She couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to the story, something that would explain why the situation escalated so quickly. But part of her knew that no matter the circumstances, the outcome was irreversible. Her father was gone. and that would never change. Ryan, meanwhile, was still trying to make sense of it all. He couldn't stop thinking about Naomi and the pain she must be in. He realized that soon he would have to face her. How could he explain what had happened? How could he look her in the eyes, knowing that his actions had robbed her of a father she clearly loved and respected? The thought of facing Naomi terrified him. He knew that no matter what he said or did, it wouldn't bring her father back. He would have to confront not just the consequences of his actions, but the deep, unspoken pain he had caused another human being. As much as he wished there was something he could do to change things, he knew that some things were beyond repair. The moment would come, though, when he would have to meet Naomi, the woman who had lost everything, including the father she'd always admired, and he wondered what she would say to him. Officer Ryan couldn't shake the feeling of dread that seemed to follow him everywhere. Each day after the incident, the weight of what he had done felt heavier. It wasn't just the grief of taking an innocent life that tormented him, but the uncertainty about the path that lay ahead. The man he had killed was no ordinary person. General Marcus Williams wasn't just a soldier. He was a hero, a leader, someone who had given his life for his country. And Ryan had taken that away. As the days turned into weeks, the world seemed to grow colder for Ryan. His colleagues, once friendly, now kept their distance, unsure of how to approach him. He had become the subject of endless questions, whispered conversations, and hushed tones. It wasn't just the media that was asking questions. His own department had begun its internal investigation. What had happened on that day? Could the situation have been avoided? And most importantly, why had he acted so quickly without fully assessing the threat? Ryan couldn't answer all of them. He thought about the moment every day. He had been trained to handle tense situations, to trust his instincts and rely on his training, but nothing had prepared him for what happened that day. The general had not been acting violently, at least not in a way that seemed to warrant such an extreme response. But when the man made a move toward him, Ryan had reacted instinctively. He had called Max, his K-9, to subdue the general, never imagining that the situation would escalate so quickly. In the days that followed, Ryan found himself replaying that moment over and over, trying to figure out what he could have done differently. If only he had paused for a moment longer. If only he had tried a different approach. But it was too late for that now. The general was dead, and Ryan was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. Despite the inner turmoil, Ryan couldn't ignore the fact that he would soon have to face Naomi, the general's daughter. She was an FBI agent, someone who was just as committed to the truth as he was, and now she was tasked with investigating her own father's death. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Naomi would want answers, just like everyone else. She had every right to be angry, to want justice, and no matter how hard he tried to explain what had happened, Ryan knew it wouldn't be enough to ease her pain. Naomi's presence in the investigation made everything even more complicated for Ryan. He had always respected the FBI's work, but now, facing someone who was both a fellow law enforcement officer and the daughter of the man he had killed, Ryan wasn't sure how he would manage. What could he say to her? How could he make her understand that he never wanted this to happen? As much as Ryan wanted to avoid the inevitable confrontation, he knew he couldn't. He had a duty to explain his actions, to answer for the tragic outcome of that day. The weight of the responsibility was unbearable, but it was something he would have to face head-on. He couldn't change the past, but perhaps he could help Naomi find some form of closure, even if it meant facing the consequences of his own mistakes. Every night, Ryan lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts of Naomi, of the general. The investigation into General Marcus Williams' death had only just begun, and Naomi Williams was already overwhelmed. She had always prided herself on being able to stay calm and focused, even in the most difficult situations. But this was different. This was personal. Her father, a respected military leader, had been killed, and the person responsible was a fellow law enforcement officer, someone from the very same community she belonged to. The conflict within her was almost unbearable. She wanted to stay professional, to do her job, But a part of her just couldn't ignore the fact that this was her father, the man she had loved and admired her whole life. Naomi spent long hours at the FBI office, poring over the reports and evidence from the scene. The details of the incident were still murky, but what was clear was that it had escalated quickly. Her father, as far as she knew, had not been a threat to the officer. There had been no signs of aggression or violence. So why had the situation ended the way it did? Why had the officer felt the need to call in his K-9 partner to subdue a man who, by all accounts, had not posed an immediate danger? Naomi couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story, if something had triggered the officer to act in such a way. The more she read, the more questions she had. She had always believed that law enforcement officers were supposed to protect and serve, not react out of fear or impulse. She couldn't reconcile the officer's actions with the man she was reading about in the reports. He had been a dedicated public servant, just like her father, but something had gone horribly wrong that day. And Naomi knew that, in order to find the truth, she would need to keep her emotions in check, no matter how much it hurt. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan was facing his own set of challenges. The media frenzy surrounding the incident had made. As the investigation into General Marcus Williams' death continued, Naomi found herself in a constant battle between her personal grief and her professional duty. She couldn't help but feel torn in every direction. Her father's death was a loss that would haunt her for the rest of her life. And yet, as an FBI agent, she had a responsibility to uncover the truth, regardless of how painful it was. But the truth was elusive, and Naomi wasn't sure if she was ready to confront it, especially when it involved someone from her own world, a fellow officer, one who had once been trusted to serve and protect. The media had already latched onto the story, broadcasting every new development. The public's response was divided, with some demanding answers and others voicing their outrage over the death of a beloved and respected military leader. Social media exploded with opinions, many questioning whether the officer had acted out of fear or, worse, racial bias. The pressure on Naomi to get answers was immense. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, and she knew that no matter what she discovered, someone would be angry. She could already hear the voices of the people who would never believe that this was an accident, and the ones who would accuse her of not doing enough because of her personal connection to the case. In the quiet moments, when Naomi was alone with her thoughts, she wondered if her father had ever felt this kind of pressure. He had always carried himself with such calm confidence, never letting anything break his focus. Naomi had admired that about him. But now she felt as though she was drowning under the expectations of those around her. She had always believed that justice was black and white, that the law was simple and should be upheld with clarity. But now, with her father's death in the mix, she was beginning to see the gray areas that she had once ignored. Nothing was simple anymore. The world wasn't black and white, and neither was the situation with the officer who had taken her father's life. As she dug deeper into the case, Naomi couldn't shake the thought of Officer Ryan, the man who had caused the tragedy. He wasn't just a faceless officer to her anymore. He was someone she had to face. She had to investigate him, and she knew that at some point she would have to confront him directly. But what would that confrontation look like? Would she be able to look him in the eye, knowing that his actions had forever changed the course of her life? Or would she be overwhelmed by the emotion and anger she felt? She couldn't predict how she would react, but she knew that whatever happened next, it would shape her future forever. Ryan, on the other hand, continued to spiral in a cycle of guilt and regret. He felt trapped in a situation he never could have anticipated. There were days when he could hardly bring himself to get out of bed, knowing that he would have to face the investigation and eventually answer for what had happened. The thought of Naomi, the woman who had just lost her father and would now be tasked with finding out what went wrong, haunted him. How could he explain to her that he hadn't meant for this to happen? That he had only done what he thought was necessary to protect himself and his partner? There were no words that could bring the general back, no words that could undo the damage. Ryan had always been a man of action, someone who had never backed down from a challenge. But this was different. This was the kind of challenge that didn't have a clear path forward. He couldn't fight this with courage or quick thinking. He could only face the consequences and try to find a way to make things right, even though he knew that, in the end, there might not be any way to fix the damage he had caused. The tension in the air was palpable, and both Naomi and Ryan knew that their paths would soon cross in ways neither of them could have predicted. For Naomi, it meant confronting a fellow officer who had killed her father, a task that felt like an impossible mission. For Ryan, it meant facing the woman who would forever be the reminder of his mistake, the woman whose father he had taken away. Their meeting, when it happened, would be the moment that defined everything to come, whether they would find a way to understand each other, or whether the pain and anger would drive them further apart. The tension had been building for weeks, and Naomi knew that the moment she had been dreading was finally approaching. The investigation into her father's death had reached a point where there were no more distractions, no more avoiding the inevitable. She would have to meet Officer Ryan, the man responsible for the tragic incident that had torn her world apart. Naomi had spent sleepless nights thinking about what she would say when they finally came face to face. Would she demand answers? Would she lash out in anger, unable to contain the pain she felt? Or would she remain composed and professional, as she had been trained to do? Ryan, on the other hand, was filled with a mix of fear and regret. He had heard rumors about Naomi's investigation, and he knew that eventually he would have to meet her. The thought of facing the daughter of the man he had killed haunted him. What could he possibly say to her? How could he explain that it had been an accident, that he had never intended for things to go so wrong? He had thought about this moment every day, but no matter how many times he imagined it, he still couldn't find the words. He had made a mistake, a horrible mistake, and now he would have to answer for it. The day of the meeting came quickly. Naomi walked into the small room where the meeting had been arranged, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen Ryan's picture in the reports, but seeing him in person was different. He looked just like any other officer. Nothing about his appearance stood out to her, except for the deep sadness in his eyes. It was clear that he was carrying the weight of the situation, just as she was. But that didn't change the fact that he had taken her father's life. Ryan stood up when Naomi entered the room. He tried to make eye contact, but his eyes quickly dropped to the floor, unable to meet hers. Naomi couldn't help but notice how much he seemed to be struggling. It was as if the guilt was written all over him, and she couldn't decide if that made her feel worse or better. On one hand, it was clear that he understood the gravity of the situation. On the other hand, it didn't change the fact that her father was gone, and nothing could bring him back. Officer Ryan. Naomi's voice was steady, though she could feel the anger and sadness bubbling up inside her. She had to stay focused. You know why we're here? Ryan nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, Agent Williams. I know. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who your father was when I first saw him. And when he moved toward me, I just reacted. I never thought it would end like this. I never wanted it to happen. Naomi's heart twisted as she listened to him speak. His words were full of remorse, but she couldn't help but feel that they were just words. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't bring her father back. But as she looked at him, she also saw the pain in his eyes. He wasn't the cold, heartless officer she had imagined in her darkest thoughts. He was a man who had made a mistake, a huge mistake, and was now paying the price for it. For a moment, there was silence between them. Naomi didn't know what to say. She had so many questions, so many emotions, but in that moment, she wasn't sure if it would matter. Her father was gone, and nothing could bring him back. Do you know what my father meant to me? Naomi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He was a leader, someone who cared about his country, about people like you and me. He gave his life to this country, and now he's gone. And you took him from me. Ryan closed his eyes, his face contorted in pain. I know. I know, and I can't express how sorry I am. I would do anything to change what happened." The room was thick with emotion, but neither of them knew what to say next. The answers they both sought seemed unreachable, as though the truth was something they couldn't grasp no matter how hard they tried. The meeting didn't bring them the closure they both hoped for, but it did bring them something else, an understanding that they were both victims of a terrible mistake, and perhaps in time, they could find a way to heal. Naomi stood up slowly, looking at Ryan one last time. "This isn't over. You'll have to face the consequences of your actions. But right now, I just need time." She turned and walked out of the room, her heart heavy, but her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. She didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time, she felt like she might someday find peace, even if it was just a little bit of it. After the meeting with Officer Ryan, Naomi felt a strange mix of emotions. The anger and sadness that had consumed her since her father's death were still there, but something else had shifted. The confrontation hadn't brought the clarity she was hoping for, but it had helped her see Ryan in a new light. It was clear that he wasn't the cold, uncaring officer she had imagined. He was human, just like her, struggling with the consequences of a tragic mistake. But despite that understanding, Naomi knew that the journey ahead would still be difficult. The weeks that followed were filled with long nights, filled with contemplation. Naomi threw herself into her work, diving deeper into the investigation, though a part of her knew that the outcome would not bring her the resolution she sought. She could still hear the words Ryan had said, how sorry he had sounded. But the reality of what had happened, her father's life lost, remained a painful, undeniable truth. The justice she had hoped for was not a simple matter of finding answers. It was about confronting her own grief and accepting the irreversible nature of what had occurred. Naomi's investigation continued, but now she was torn. The professional in her pushed her to dig deeper, to uncover the facts and ensure that justice was done, no matter the cost. But the daughter in her wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all. She thought about her father often, about the life he had led, and the way he had always put others first. He had been a protector, someone who believed in the strength of his country and the people who served in it. And now he was gone. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Naomi was faced with a difficult decision. She would have to recommend whether or not Officer Ryan should face legal consequences for his actions. No matter what decision she made, it was clear that someone would be unhappy. The public had already weighed in, with some demanding harsh punishment, and others arguing that Ryan had made an honest mistake. Naomi understood the weight of the decision she had to make, but it was more than just the law now. It was about finding a balance between justice and compassion, between the responsibility of an officer and the humanity of a person who had never meant for things to end the way they did. The days seemed to stretch on, each one a little harder than the last. Naomi had become withdrawn, quieter than usual, as though the grief had built walls around her that she couldn't break through. Her colleagues noticed the change, but they didn't know how to help. She had always been the one who led with strength and confidence, but now, it seemed like the world had taken something from her that she couldn't get back. One afternoon, Naomi stood in front of her father's photo, something she had kept on her desk for years. The picture showed him smiling, his uniform pristine, his eyes full of warmth and pride. She had always looked up to him, admired him for the way he carried himself and his ability to bring people together. Now she felt as though that image was all she had left. It was hard to accept that she would never hear his voice again, or see his face light up when he spoke about something he loved. Despite the pain, Naomi knew she had to move forward. It was what her father would have wanted. He had always believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. She knew that she had to do the same, even if the path ahead was uncertain. But she also realized something that gave her a small measure of peace. There would never be a simple resolution to this tragedy. The pain of loss would never fully go away, but there were still ways to honor her father's memory, by carrying forward the lessons he had taught her, and by finding a way to heal, even if it meant taking one step at a time. The final decision was made. Officer Ryan would face consequences for his actions, though the nature of those consequences was not as severe as some had hoped. Naomi's decision was not made lightly, but it was one she could live with. It was the only way to move forward, to allow for both justice and understanding. It was a difficult balance, but she knew that, in the end, it was the right thing to do. As Naomi left the office that day, she felt a sense of quiet resolution. The road ahead would be long, and there were still many questions without answers. But at least for now, she had done what she could. She had faced the truth of her father's death, and in doing so, she had learned to navigate the complexities of grief, justice, and forgiveness. The memory of her father would live on in her heart, and she would honor him by continuing to fight for the values he had instilled in her, even if it meant carrying the burden of that fight alone.